What's happening, everybody? Greg Ehrenberg here from Stokastic.com, and it's time to break down another UFC slate sponsored by DraftKings Rainmakers. And for this weekend, talking about the main event, Song Yadong taking on Ricky Simón, and then a lot of other interesting spots. A lot has been shuffled about this card as the week has gone on. I mean, this wasn't even expected to be the main event at first. This was a fight Simón and Yadong was supposed to be on last week's card, and then it got pushed back to this week. It got made a 5-round main event, and it was supposed to be 3 rounds last week. So maybe that could impact something, because it's not like either of these guys were preparing in advance for a 5-round fight. And then also, we've already had a couple of fights fall out over the course of the week. We've seen some other new opponents get mixed in. So Brian Kelleher was supposed to be taking on Journey Newsom, and now Keller's out of the fight. So now we've got Newsom taking on... by the way, also something else to note about the pricing of that fight. Journey Newsom is $7,300 taking on Marcus McGee, $7,200. So no matter what in that fight, we're going to get an extremely cheap fighter who comes away with a win. Lots of interesting talking points here from a DFS standpoint, and I'm going to be getting into all of it and pulling some data up on the screen so we could walk through this. Like I mentioned also, we are sponsored by DraftKings Rainmakers. I'm going to be breaking down some Rainmaker stuff as we go, and at the end, I'll build out Rainmakers lineups. And if you guys haven't checked out Rainmakers yet on DraftKings, check it out using the link we have below in the description box, because when you click on that link, you claim a free starters pack for the PGA Rainmaker product. You get to pick a stud golfer, and then that's also going to come with a pack with a handful of other golfers to help you build out lineups, play in some starters contests with it, win cash prizes, win packs, stuff like that to make you build out your portfolio and make some money along the way. And totally free to sign up and use that starters pack. But let's break down the UFC slate, starting with a really tight main event between Ricky Simón and Song Yadong. And I got crushed by the main event last week. I was heavier on the Curtis Blaydes side of it. And here's where I knew that I was going to be screwed last week. They're running these interview packages, pre-fight tape, where, in between fights, they're trying to kill some time. They're interviewing the fighters, and it's pre-recorded. And all Curtis Blaydes is talking about in his interview is that he's going to knock out Sergey Pavlovich, how much he's been working on his striking. It's underrated. And I go, shit, I'm screwed. He's not going to look to wrestle. He's going to get knocked out. That's what ended up happening. So if I could have changed my lineups in that moment when I heard that interview, I would have. But unfortunately, that was not a viable option right there. So I did have an out, though. So I had a Rainmakers lineup that finished 7th in the Elite contest. And had Bobby Green won his fight, I would have come in first place. But unfortunately, that was not the case. So I ended up coming in 7th place. I was like 50 points out of first. Nobody in front of me had Bobby Green. And of course, Bobby Green wins it first by first-round knockout. But then it was determined that he won via headbutt, and ended up being very tilting to not really get any points out of that fight, because I did have a lot of exposure to Bobby Green, both in DFS and Rainmakers. So definitely a little bit of a blue balls feeling on that one. But move on to this week, and starting main event, Song Yadong and Ricky Simón. And this is a fight that I'm going to be somewhat split on. I'm leaning a little bit more heavily towards the Ricky Simón side, but this fight is close to a pick'em at sportsbooks, and it is really difficult to know how the change from a 3-round fight to a 5-round fight is going to impact these guys, because I do feel it's going to have some sort of impact, but I'm just not going to know what it is until after the fight plays out. So I'm going to be pretty split on these guys, leaning a little bit more towards Ricky Simón just because of this. In a win, I expect Ricky Simón to score better than what Song Yadong would score in a win for him. And a lot of that just has to do with the wrestling and grappling upside from Ricky Simón. Ricky Simón lands 6.55 takedowns per 15 minutes. So if you're talking about this guy now in a 25-minute fight, if it was to go the distance, just at these kind of rates, you're looking at close to 10 takedowns for Ricky Simón. So with that in mind, I think Ricky Simón is, by the way, it'd actually be more than 10 takedowns, but Ricky Simón should be an excellent score just based on output. Scores 3.04 significant strikes per minute, 6.55 takedowns. And I think he's going to have to look to shoot for these takedowns pretty early and often, because I do think that Song Yadong is the better striker in this matchup. Also a lot more dangerous on the feet. He is live to knock out Ricky Simón, but I do think the slightly more likely outcome is that Ricky Simón finds wrestling and grappling success. He's able to control positions against Song Yadong, and I think that is a path to victory for him. And then also, we've seen in some of Song Yadong's past fights, and not recent ones, but has happened in previous fights, we've seen him get a little bit tired in the 3rd round of some of his 3-round fights. We've seen him at times also struggle to defend takedowns and struggle to get up after he's been held down. One thing that really stands out to me watching some of his previous fights, the fight against Kyler Phillips. Phillips in that fight ended up landing 3 takedowns, held over a minute of control time against Song Yadong, landed 3 of 5 takedowns. And Ricky Simón is a much better wrestler, in my opinion, than Kyler Phillips. Now, with that said, that fight was quite a while ago, and Song Yadong is really young. He was also taken down a couple of times by Marlon Vera. I know that Song Yadong ended up winning the decision in that fight. I personally thought Vera won at the time. When I was rewatching the fight for this week, I still thought that Marlon Vera had won. And also, another spot where we saw Vera have some wrestling success, ended up landing 2 of 3 takedowns, over 3 minutes of control time. So this is the sort of thing where I'm looking at these spots that we've seen from Song Yadong against wrestler grappler type fighters in the past, or at least fighters like Marlon Vera who have implemented a wrestling and grappling game plan against him, and they've had a lot of success. So I could see that being a path to victory for Ricky Simón, and that's why I'm leaning towards him for DraftKings purposes. This is a fight that I'm going to be nearly all in on in large field tournaments. Probably something like a 60-40 split in favor of Simón. I think both of them warrant consideration, and considering some of the unknowns, it is pretty hard to have a really strong lean on the main event, but a slight lean for me on Ricky Simón. Another fight that I like targeting, and a fighter I like a whole bunch for this weekend, Marcos Rogerio de Lima, very dangerous striker, and I'm just really unimpressed with Waldo Cortez Acosta. I know that he had his win on the Contender Series against Suzar, where he looked fairly decent, and that did bring him some hype heading into the UFC, but his matchup since then, he's been really underwhelming to me. Cool, he outstruck Jared Vanderaa, but Jared Vanderaa is not very good. He outstruck Chase Sherman. Chase Sherman also not very good, and that fight was probably a little bit more competitive than it should have been. And I also don't think there's that much finishing equity in Waldo Cortez Acosta. Like, if you can't finish guys like Jared Vanderaa or Chase Sherman, I really struggle to think that he's going to have that much success against Marcos Rogerio de Lima, who is definitely presenting an uptick in competition for Waldo Cortez Acosta, who also doesn't have a ton of experience, particularly in the UFC. And not the greatest gas tank in the world on Marcos Rogerio de Lima, but he is super dangerous in the early going. And if he's able to land a takedown in the first couple minutes of the fight, I think he's very live for a submission or a ground and pound finish. We just haven't really seen much of Cortez Acosta off his back. And a lot of times we have not seen that be the case, particularly at heavyweight. They're generally not good in that realm. So Marcos Rogerio de Lima comes out super aggressive in the early going of his fights, does land over a takedown per 15 minutes. He wrestles fairly aggressively before he gasses out, striking 3.57 significant strikes per minute landed to 2.41. So a positive striking differential. Some recent fights, Marcos Rogerio de Lima, I thought he looked pretty good in his last fight against Andrei Arlovski. Knocked him down early, got on top of him, ended up submitting him up against the cage. I think we could see something play out kind of similar in this matchup for Marcos Rogerio de Lima. You always have to get a little concerned if his fights get past the first round, but still a guy who I do think holds a lot of advantages over a lesser experienced Waldo Cortez Acosta. So I'm going with Marcos Rogerio de Lima. I'm going to be playing him in DraftKings and Rainmakers, and also something that's pretty significant scoring upside. He's a primary target for me. I want to talk about one of the other fights that I mentioned in the opening here, and that is the one between Journey Newsom and Marcus McGee. I love this fight for DraftKings purposes. And the main reason is because we are guaranteed. Well, I don't want to say 100% guaranteed, because you get that nonsense that happened with Bobby Green last week where, there's a no contest ruled after an incidental headbutt in the first round. But outside of anything, lightning striking, anything really weird, Journey Newsom is $7,300. Marcus McGee is $7,200. And Marcus McGee is taking this fight on 2 days' notice. So I do question how well prepared he is going to be for this fight. But when I watched some of the available tape on, he's not all that experienced. He only has a handful of professional fights. He did look better than what I was expecting, particularly in the striking department. But here's what I really like about this fight. Other than the fact that they're both really cheap, it's also minus 195 to finish inside the distance. It's minus 160 for the under 2.5 rounds. So not only are you getting a winner from a close to min price type price range, low 7K range, you're also getting a fight with a lot of finishing equity for whoever wins. So that makes it a prime fight to target. I have to favor the Journey Newsom side just because Newsom's been preparing for this fight. He's been preparing for a difficult matchup against Brian Kelleher. And I do think DeMarcus McGee, while maybe better than a lot of people expect, it is still an easier fight for Journey Newsom than the matchup against Brian Keller, because Journey Newsom goes from a nearly 2-1 underdog to a nearly 2-1 favorite now in this matchup. So no data on Marcus McGee. Journey Newsom, at least historically, has not been very active, low output striking, low output in the wrestling and grappling. But because what I've seen on Marcus McGee, he's a really aggressive striker. I think he could just force the volume out of Journey Newsom. Now, Newsom also doesn't rely on it very much, but he is a black belt in BJJ. If this gets to the mat, I think he has massive advantages over McGee in that realm. So if this fight plays out on the feet and it's striking, I think it should be pretty competitive. And I do think somebody would get finished. But if Journey Newsom decides to rely on his wrestling and his grappling, I think a submission is very live for him. So I think the overall best value play on the slate for today, I'm recording this on Friday, but if you guys are watching this on Saturday, for the Saturday slate, I think Newsom is overall the best cash game option on the slate. I think for tournaments, he's a great salary saving play, but also because I expect him to be really popular and Marcus McGee is alive for a knockout, I think he serves as a leverage option. But Journey Newsom, that's going to be a prime target for me in all formats for DraftKings this weekend. Going to talk about do I want to do a bet now or do I want to save it for one more? I'll save it. All right. So one more fight that I like for Rainmakers and for DraftKings purposes. Then I'll talk about a bet that I have for this weekend. And I only have one bet as of now. If I have more, I'll add it into our Chalkboard channel. If you guys haven't checked out Chalkboard, there's a link for it below. It's totally free to download and join our channel in it as well. And we post additional bets in there. We sweat the bets with you guys and answer any questions you have. So just another free way to get some content for us. But Rodolfo Vieira, I think, is very live for an early finish against Cody Brundage. Vieira, another fighter, gasses a ton. So it always scares you when he's a big favorite. But Vieira is one of the best BJJ practitioners that we have in the UFC. And he's going to look for his takedowns in the early going in the fight. And I think they can be found against Cody Brundage. So Cody Brundage, his last couple of fights, he has not fought aggressive wrestlers or grapplers. Fought against Mikhail Olashechuk, fought against Tresean Gore. Neither one of those matchups, he didn't have to worry about takedowns. Now, with that said, he got knocked out by Olashechuk. He was able to knock out Tresean Gore. His fights before that, though, Dolce Lungiambula was able to take him down. I know Brundage ended up getting the finish via submission on the ground, but still, Lungiambula was able to take him down. Nick Maximov, who's since been cut from the UFC, was able to take down Brundage 4 times. And just based on strength and athleticism, I think Vieira should be able to get this fight down in the early going. And then if he does, I really think it's just a matter of time before he gets the finish. Really, really good grappler, Rodolfo Vieira. Like, I can't understate how athletic this guy is and how well accomplished he is as a BJJ practitioner. So I like this fight for Vieira to get a takedown in the first round and then ultimately winning by finish. So Vieira, as far as pay-up options go, he's the one that I think has the most upside on this entire slate. Him and Kyle Bahalo, I think, are the two that have the most finishing equity. But that's not really going to surprise anybody if you look at the odds at sports books. We've got Vieira is right now anywhere from like a minus 220 to minus 250 favorite, and the fight is minus 125 to finish under 1.5 rounds. And then if we talk about the Kyle Bahalo fight against Mikhail Olashechuk, you got Bahalo nearly a minus 400 favorite. And that fight also is minus 230 to finish inside the distance. So finishing equity on both Bahalo and on Vieira, but I think Vieira a little bit more live for the first round finish because he does hunt the submissions a little bit more frequently. Now, as for the one bet that I have for this card, dumb heavyweight fights. Nothing makes me feel better about betting on these than just high variance dumb heavyweight fights. But Martin Buday, super disappointing game plan his last time out against Lucas Bresky. But this is a guy in Martin Buday who, even though we haven't seen him go to his wrestling in the UFC, we have seen him with the ability to at least push guys up against the fence and just hold control time and win rounds that way. So what I have in mind is his fight against Chris Barnett, where he ends up winning. But look at the control time here. Nearly 8 minutes of control time. And what he did here, he didn't even attempt to shoot takedowns. 0 of 0. He went up, he just pushed Barnett up against the cage, held position, and just landed a bunch of kind of soft strikes up against the cage. So I had 56 significant strikes to 131 total strikes. And I think this is a path to victory for, clicked on the wrong tab there. But I think this is a path to victory for Martin Buday against Jay Collier, who, by the way, Jay Collier got finished by Chris Barnett in his last fight. But you look at Budai here, the striking stats between these guys, somewhat similar, a little bit more output on the Jay Collier side. And even though we have not seen Budai land a takedown in the UFC, we have seen him hold control time up against the fence, like I talked about before. We also have seen him go for takedowns and land them in the regional scene before he was at the UFC level. So I think he should be able to land takedowns against Jay Collier with his 67% takedown defense. But even if he doesn't, just get some control time against the fence, grind out the clock, get a victory that way. I think it's very live for Martin Budai. I think he's more paths to win this fight than Jay Collier. If this fight just takes place on the feet and these guys are just going to stand in the middle and trade, it's close to a 50-50 fight, which is exactly how it's landed. It's minus 110 on both sides at the time I'm recording this. But because you have that extra path to victory for Budai, where he could potentially land takedowns, could get the control time up against the cage, I favor him to win this fight. I think it should be closer to like a minus 150 for Martin Budai. So that's a bet that I have for this card. It's the only bet I've placed as of now. Like I said, if I end up adding more bets, I'll throw them into chalkboard. But at least as of right now, so much that has changed over the course of the week for this event. This is the only bet that I've placed. Now let's go and look at Rainmakers. And I actually got really lucky. I've already opened up some packs and I got really lucky with some of my polls. Another thing I did also, and this is just generally good strategy. As soon as I saw Brian Kelleher scratch from the card and they gave Journey Newsom a new opponent in Marcus McGee, I immediately went out and bought a bunch of really cheap Journey Newsom cards because he was like 88 cents for his core card. I was able to get a couple of his legendary cards for right around $100. So you were able to get some really cheap Journey Newsom cards. Just got to be quick to react to some of that news when there are fight changes, odds movements, stuff like that. But let's see. I'll build, because I have the cards for it, I can build a legendary lineup right here. And do I pass the location check here? Let's see. It's taking a little bit of time. All right, we nailed it. So I did list one of my Journey Newsom legendaries for sale. I had two of them that I ended up buying for relatively cheap. And I think that I should be able to flip one of them and hold a profit. And then I'll just build a lineup with the other one. I also got a legendary Marcos Rogerio de Lima in a pack. So I'm going to play with him. I think that he is a really high upside fantasy option, like I outlined before. Now, looking through some of the other ones that I have in my collection, I do think we want to get a lot of exposure to the main event. So whatever your preferred side is, I lean a little bit towards Ricky Simón in the main event. I want to have either Ricky Simón or Song Yadong in the majority of my Rainmakers lineups. Caio Bahayo, another one. I have a couple of elite cards of him. I want to throw him in here. He's just the safest play on the entire card. We don't have to worry about any kind of salary cap in Rainmakers. He's a nearly minus 400 favorite in a fight that's expected to finish inside the distance. So I like Bahayo. Talked about Rodolfo Vieira as a fighter that I think has some finishing equity. So I'll add him in. Not going to go with Brundage because I already have him. I like the upside of Julian Erosa, but he's also super risky. Really chinny, Julian Erosa. I've got Budai. I've got elites of him. I'll add one of my Journey Newsoms here, though. I have a bunch of them. Gonna have to play him somewhere. So look at this lineup I built here. All fighters who are favorites and all fighters that I think have finishing equity, or at the very least, somebody in Ricky Simona's potential to score really highly. Marcos Rogerio de Lima, love him for this format. Same with Bahayo. Same with Rodolfo Vieira. Journey Newsom is also somebody who talked about him when we were coming up, is not necessarily that he's like a minus 400 favorite or anything like that, but he is a nearly minus 200 favorite, fighting a fighter on late notice. Also, a fight that's expected to finish inside the distance. So I like this lineup quite a bit. Going to hit submit on it. All right. No fighter scratches this week. All right. Submitted. All good. No fighter scratches this week. I don't want to have any Bobby Green situations from last week. No Carl Williams getting scratched in a fight against Chase Sherman. None of that stuff. This fight's going to play out. It's going to go well. We're all going to make some money. If you guys haven't done it yet, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments for myself, leave them in chalkboard. Or if you're in our DFS Discord, I'm usually in there sweating out the fights on Saturday. We have a good time hanging out in there, chopping up the fights, sweating out our lineups, talking together. So if you're in there, one of the perks being a Stokastic Plus Platinum member, hang out on Saturday. That's going to do it for me, guys. If you haven't done it, one more time, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Good luck this weekend. See you back here next week.